If you believe kindness still matters, you'll love this story. A poor mechanic gives away his salary and changes everything. Watch till the end. Hit a like, tap subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Let's get started. The auto engine factory on the outskirts of Chicago was loud, busy, and filled with the steady rhythm of machines working through the day. Among the many workers covered in oil and sweat was a young man named Ethan Cole, only 20, yet life had already tested him in every possible way. He had no family, no home beyond a small rented room, and no possessions except a few tools and a worn-out jacket. But what made Ethan different wasn't his hardship. It was the quiet strength with which he carried it. Every morning he arrived before sunrise, unlocking the tool shed while the sky was still grey. His co-workers would find him humming softly, sleeves rolled up, preparing for the day's repairs. Despite his rough hands and patched clothes, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, yet his smile, faint and tired, carried warmth that even the coldest morning couldn't steal away. Everyone respected him, but few truly knew him. Ethan never talked about his past. When payday came around, most workers rushed to cash their checks, laughing about beer nights or new shoes. Ethan always folded his envelope carefully, tucking it inside his jacket. The others assumed he was saving for something, maybe a car, maybe school, but the truth was far more selfless. After his shift, he'd walk 3 miles to the edge of the city where a small shelter stood, the same one that had once fed him when he was 16 and homeless. There, he'd quietly hand his pay to the woman who ran the place. "For the kids," he always said, his voice barely above a whisper. She'd tried to refuse, reminding him that he needed it more than they did, but Ethan always smiled and said, "I've eaten enough from that kitchen. It's time someone else does." Then he'd leave before she could thank him. He never signed his name, never wanted recognition, only to give back a piece of what life once gave him. Inside the factory, the owner, Olivia Grant, managed things with a reputation for precision and fairness. She was in her early 30s, confident, intelligent and elegant, yet not distant. Her father had built the factory from scratch before passing away, leaving her the heavy burden of leadership. Workers respected her, but few dared to cross the invisible line between boss and employee. She expected professionalism, not friendship. But Olivia noticed things others didn't. She noticed Ethan's dedication, how he stayed late after others clocked out, and how he never ate more than a sandwich during lunch. At first, she assumed he was saving for school or debt. But as weeks passed, she saw patterns that didn't add up. Ethan refused overtime bonuses, always declined raises, and sometimes looked pale from exhaustion. One Friday evening, as rain poured across the city, Olivia was leaving when she spotted Ethan walking alone down the street, heading toward the shelter district. Something about the image struck her deeply, the young mechanic, soaked and tired, carrying his pay envelope close to his chest. Curiosity overcame hesitation. She followed him discreetly, keeping her umbrella low, blending with the shadows. Ethan stopped near a flickering streetlight outside a small brick building. The sign above it read, "Hope's Corner Shelter." He entered quickly, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Olivia hesitated, then peeked through the window. Inside, she saw him hand his envelope to a grey-haired woman. His words were faint, but filled with sincerity. "This should cover next week's meals," he said. "I'll bring more after the next shift." Olivia felt her breath catch. She'd seen men donate for charity dinners or corporate awards, but never like this. Never out of pure, invisible kindness. She waited until he left, then quietly approached the shelter. The woman inside recognized her from the local news and looked surprised. "You know that young man?" she asked. Olivia nodded slightly. "He works for me," the woman smiled sadly. "He's been helping us for months. That boy gives more than he can afford." That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. She sat in her office at home, surrounded by design blueprints and glowing screens, yet her mind was elsewhere. The factory she ran was worth millions. producing engines that powered luxury cars, yet one of her poorest workers had shown her a kind of wealth she'd never understood. She thought of her father's lessons about honor and humanity, how he built the company to give people purpose. Somewhere along the way, that message had been buried beneath profit reports. Ethan had reminded her of it without saying a word. The next morning, Ethan arrived early as usual. The rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds, shining softly on the wet concrete. Olivia watched from her glass office as he cleaned his tools, careful and methodical. She noticed the way he handled every piece of machinery, not as metal, but as something alive, something that deserved care. She realized that this young man, with no family name or degree, embodied the very soul of craftsmanship her company had once stood for. Later that day, she asked her assistant, "Does Ethan Cole have any family listed in his records?" The assistant checked the files and shook her head. "No, ma'am. Orphaned at 15. He's been on his own ever since." Olivia leaned back, eyes distant. She wanted to thank him, to acknowledge him, yet she feared embarrassing him in front of others. Ethan wasn't the type to seek attention. He'd probably disappear if he thought he'd been noticed. That evening, as the factory lights dimmed and workers left one by one, Olivia walked down to the floor. Ethan was still there, tightening bolts on an engine mount. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice echoing through the empty hall. He looked up, startled. "Just finishing up, ma'am. Didn't want to leave it halfway." She smiled faintly. "You remind me of someone," she said. "My father used to say, people who fix machines often fix lives too." Ethan chuckled softly but said nothing. He didn't know she meant him. When he finally packed up and walked home, Olivia watched him disappear into the fading light. The sound of his footsteps echoed in her heart, carrying a message stronger than words. She turned back to the quiet factory floor, smelling oil and steel, and whispered to herself, "We need more men like him." That night, she drafted an idea that would soon change both their lives, a program that would reward selfless workers like Ethan, giving them education and security. But she decided not to tell him yet. As days passed, Olivia continued to observe him, discreetly but with growing admiration. She saw how other workers trusted him, how he fixed their machines without asking for help, how he lent his lunch to an old cleaner when she forgot hers. To everyone, Ethan was just the quiet kid in the corner. But to Olivia, he had become something more, a living reminder that kindness doesn't need a stage, it only needs a heart that refuses to close. The more she saw, the more she understood something profound. Greatness wasn't built in offices or meetings. It was built in moments like these, where a tired mechanic covered in grease chose to give rather than take. Olivia Grant had managed hundreds of employees, sealed million-dollar deals, and expanded her father's legacy. Yet for the first time in years, she felt small, humbled, in the presence of one man's quiet integrity. And while Ethan slept peacefully that night, unaware of the eyes that had finally seen him for who he truly was, the woman who once measured success by numbers began to measure it by something else entirely: heart. The morning began quietly in the factory. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the vast space, each note familiar and rhythmic. Ethan arrived early as always, unaware that the day ahead would change everything. He greeted the gatekeeper, adjusted his worn gloves, and went straight to his workstation. His focus was the same as every day: fix what's broken, do it right, and move on. But in Olivia Grant's office upstairs, something was different. She had spent the entire night replaying his words in her mind. Kindness shouldn't be seen, it should be felt. When she had first heard him say it, standing there with his eyes lowered and his voice calm, she'd felt something shift deep inside her. It wasn't pity, it was admiration. She had met investors, engineers, and executives with polished words and practiced smiles. But this boy, this orphaned mechanic,